Rather cold and wet in the garage. Why don't we go inside, have a cup of tea and talk about wiring? Right, that's a bit better. I thought I'd talk through how I went about replacing the wiring harness on my P5B coupe. You can see just about that I've got some of the things that I use, so I'll talk that through and show some pictures from the process I went through as well. So I'll just grab a cup of tea and then we will start going through that. Okay, so I should just say that I've written the first part of an article with a lot more detail than this video. That's on the Rover P5.com website. It's probably going to be 2 parts, maybe 3, going through the whole process that I went through on replacing the wiring harness. There were 2 main reasons. I'll get into more detail in the article, but there are 2 main reasons that I replaced the harness. One was that a lot of the wires were fraying and damaged. That could have been repaired, splicing in new pieces of wire. But also the car had an engine fire several years ago and it had been repaired really badly. And so there was a bit of a mix of different looms for different years of car, things like that. So basically, you can read more about it on the roverp5.com website, but basically I decided to replace the loom, and luckily I found one on eBay, brand new old stock, which was in really good condition. So I basically set about replacing the loom. I gave it quite a lot of thought because I hadn't done that before, and it's a bit of a daunting job. Gave it a lot of thought and planned out how I was going to do that, and as I say, that's in the article, but I will quickly go through that and I'll show you some photos of the process I went through. But I thought I'd start by just showing some of the tools that I used that I really recommend you buy. And it doesn't matter where you get them from, but I recommend you buy these. These are similar tools. I've put links in the description, the video description, to all of these, and also they're in the article on the website. Okay, so I'll just change the camera angle and then we'll get into a bit of the detail about what I did. Okay, so let's talk about some of the tools and consumables that I used and I recommend if you're doing any work on wiring on your car. First thing you need is a multimeter. I quite like these pen style ones because you can see the display without having to prop it up in the car or twist around to see it. You can probe, there's a retracting probe, so you can probe quite easily without fear of shorting anything out. This one is made by Mastec. It has DC volts. Well, this has got more, but you at least really need DC volts and a continuity tester with an audible buzzer, ideally. I added a 3 meter long lead with a clip on the end so that I could clip this on, say in the engine bay, and then go and probe behind the dashboard if I needed to. 3 meters is a good length to have, so I just made that myself. Then tools. These are the Crimp or Bullock insertion tool. I recommend you get these. They're not absolutely necessary, I guess, but what these allow you to do is insert Bullock connectors into connector blocks really easily, and also do it uniformly and push them all the way in. It'll actually kind of deform the insulation as it presses them in. It does that without damaging the wire. Just really useful, and they make inserting Bullock connectors much easier. You'll see in some of the photos of my car, when I bought the car, a lot of the Bullock connectors were coming loose. Then crimp tools. So you'll need 2 crimp tools, two types of crimp tool. This is for Bullock connectors, and it puts a hexagonal crimp on the Bullock connector. It crimps really well. These aren't particularly cheap, I think £30–35, but definitely worth getting if you're doing work on a Rover P5. and I'll show you the Bullock connectors in a minute. So that's one kind of crimp tool. This is a more standard or modern type Lucar 1/4 inch 6mm spade connector type crimp. Again, definitely worth getting. It crimps both parts of the connector, so it crimps into the insulator and also around the conductor as well, and it does that in one step. You probably can't see, but there are step jaws. There are cheap versions of these. The problem I found with the very cheap ones is that the jaws don't align properly and they don't make a good crimp. So again, I've put a recommendation for what I would buy in there. These get used a lot, and you can use these on other cars as well. So then let's talk about connectors. So you'll need a selection of kind of Lucar style connectors. So these are a standard kind of 1/4 inch 6mm that you can get for any modern car. Don't use the pre-insulated ones, they're pretty horrible. These are, you know, proper. They've got two parts to the crimp. They support the insulator and crimp onto the cable. So you'll need a selection of those. These are, you can see these are tinned. You can get brass coloured as well. I guess probably tinned is going to last longer because it won't react with water so much. This is a flag type connector, so I think this is only used in one or two places in the P5, or on mine I think connecting to the alternator. Not absolutely necessary, but again, you know, you can get flag type 1/4 inch connectors that come in from the side, and you can get the insulating covers for those. Then there's a couple of kind of more specialized type or size of connectors. So these are 1/2 inch or 6mm. This is 3/8 inch and this is 1/2 inch. The 1/2 inch in particular, you can get these from Auto Sparks. These are used where there's a connection block under the dashboard where the ammeter shunt is located and the feed out to the ammeter, and these are 1/2 inch. These are, I think, about £5 each, so they're not cheap. You know, hopefully you wouldn't need to replace them because the factory or the loom supplier, the harness supplier to Rover actually welded the cable to these. That's obviously going to be very difficult to reproduce, but it can be useful to have one or two of these as spares. As I say, available from Auto Sparks. I can't find anywhere else that has those. So they're quite specialised but quite useful. These are the Bullock connectors. So they're basically a hollow tube that's shaped a bit like a bullet, I guess. You insert the wire in the back, you crimp it with the crimp tool, and then I soldered. So you can see that they're hollow down the middle, so you can solder the end or the tip of them and get solder in as well. Rover, the P5 uses a lot of these. Most of the loom is using Bullock connectors, so you need a selection. You can get different size for different size cables, so you'll need 2 or 3 different sizes of Bullock connectors. Again, tinned and untinned. Then these are the Bullock connector or Bullock terminal connectors, I guess you'd call them. These are, again, they're used a lot throughout the Rover. You can get these in different sizes. So this is for 2 Bullock connectors. You can get to connect 4 together. And if you look at these aren't kind of multi-pole connectors. So if you insert 4 wires into these, then all 4 wires will be joined together. They're kind of made of rolled spring steel, I think. They're not the most reliable type of connector. The spring steel can break. I've seen a few where the spring steel is broken, but that's the only way really to connect Bullock connectors together. So you can get these in kind of single wire, 2 wire. You can also get 3 wire, which has 6. So it's kind of triangular shaped at the end. Again, that's joining all the wires together. The exception to that, certainly from all the ones that I've seen, is the 5 wire Bullock connector block. So this is multipole, so each of those is individually insulated from each other. The P5 does use these in 2 or 3 places, so you know, again, it's handy to have a few of these as spares. And as I say, these are individual, so each wire isn't joined to the other wires. So definitely worth getting a selection of those. You'll also need some fuses. So the P5 uses 1 1/4 inch fuses, 31, 32 millimeter. So you want a selection of those. I think most of them from memory are 10 or 15 amp. This is 5 amp. It can be useful getting the ones with a paper insert in them. It's easier to see, otherwise it's stamped around the end cap and very difficult to see. So these are fairly widely available. Fuses, useful to have a selection of those as well. Couple of other things. So if you're doing any work on the loom or the harness, then these are really useful. These are reusable cable ties. They're basically made of a kind of Velcro type material. You can unwrap part of the loom and use these to hold the loom together. You can move them around, you can undo them to put more wires in. Just really useful. Rather than using tape or cable or normal cable ties, these reusable ones are really useful, and they're dirt cheap as well. Then loom tape, or harness tape. So if you unwrap part of the loom or the harness, so obviously the harness, most of it is a bunch of wires that are then wrapped around with harness tape. Whatever you do, don't use normal insulation tape. The adhesive on that just turns to goo really quickly. This is harness tape. It's not got any glue on it. But you basically wrap it around the loom, overlapping about 1/3 or 1/4, and as you do that, if you pull it slightly as you're doing that, it forms a really watertight seal. It doesn't kind of amalgamate. It's not like self-amalgamating tape, but it does work really well and hold the loom in place and watertight. So get harness tape, this PVC type. There is cloth tape, a cloth version of this. Certainly on the P5B, Rover didn't use that. I don't know whether they used it on earlier P5s, but I've only ever seen the PVC type used. And then wires. So obviously if you're doing any work, I mean, if you're just buying a harness, then you probably won't need to buy a lot of individual wires. But if you're adding anything, any components, then you'll need a selection of wire. Obviously wire comes in different cross-section areas for different current ratings. But in the P5B as well, and maybe in the P5, it's basically the loom is a mixture of this braided cable and normal PVC type cable. So PVC is just any modern PVC car cable is fine. What I do recommend though is making the effort to get the right color codes. If you're replacing cable or adding new components, get the right color coding. It'll just make fault finding and future maintenance a lot easier, and it'll look better rather than just using red or black or whatever's to hand. So put in a bit of effort, get the right color codes. Vehicle wiring products do these in a massive range of colors. Obviously this is white purple, so white is the main color and purple is the tracer color. There's red white version as well. So that's the PVC cable. Now the PVC cable was used kind of after the fuse is in the P5B mainly. I have seen some cars where the whole loom is PVC wire, but on mine and I think on most of them, the wiring from the battery to the fuse box, so the unfused wiring, is using this braided cable. It's not that widely used, but Auto Sparks do a big range of these, so you can get this. You can still get this in a variety of color codes. And what's interesting about this, well, two things I think. One is I'm not quite sure why Rover used this on the unfused side, other than all I can think is that because it's kind of double insulated, it adds an extra layer of protection to the unfused wires from the battery going to the fuse box. So that may be the reason they used it. But because if you can see, although the outside is braided, the inside is PVC cable, and I assume it's fairly standard, modern PVC cable, and they just put this braiding over it. So I've cut back the braiding and left the inside insulation there. And inside that obviously is just standard copper wire. As I say, I'm not quite sure why Rover used this on the unfused side, other than an extra layer of protection. But what you can see is if you look at your wiring on your car, if the outside braiding is fraying, and it does do that quite a lot, as you'll see in some photos in a minute, it may be still that the insulation inside is fine. I mean, you need to be careful, but it's if the outer braiding is fraying, it doesn't mean the cable is completely unsafe. But obviously it is a sign that something's not quite right. And there was a lot in my car, a lot where the outer braiding had frayed. Some wires, the inner insulation had broken as well, exposing the wires. So obviously that needs replacing if that's the case. But yeah, that's available from Autosparks, as I say, and again, worth getting the right colour codes for whatever you're doing on the car. Right, I think that's it. Obviously you need a decent knife as well. Things like pliers, wire cutters, small screwdrivers, things like that. But these are the main kind of, not specialised, but things that you may not have in your toolbox until you get into working on your car. Right, I think that is everything. Okay, one last thing actually before we get into the photos. And hopefully, I'm not sure whether you can hear the dog in the background, but my extra. So the other thing you need is really good wiring diagram. The one in the workshop manual, the wiring diagram in the workshop manual is really bad. It's black and white only, it's small, it's got some mistakes in it as well. Not a good wiring diagram to try and work from. If you're a P5 club member, there is a free PDF version available that someone created, put a lot of effort into creating a colour version of it. And because when I rewired or put a new harness into my car, I wanted to make some changes, and things like rear fog light I wanted to add. I wanted to add an inertia cut-off switch for the electric fuel pump on my car. Standard, it has a mechanical fuel pump, but electric fuel pump is quite a common upgrade. And really, if you have an electric fuel pump, you need an inertia cut-off switch. That's like it's kind of pendulum inside a plastic housing, so that if there's an impact, it breaks the circuit and stops the fuel pump. Otherwise, you could have an accident, and if the power is still on in the car, it will still be pumping fuel into the engine. If the engine stopped, it could be a hot engine, not good. So I wanted to add an inertia cut-off switch. I also wanted to add, what else was there? Hazard lights I wanted to add. And fit relays for the headlights. So as standard, the headlight switch basically takes the full current for the headlights, so I wanted to add relays for dip and main beam. So I wanted to make some changes, and you'll see in the photos in a minute some of the things that I did and how I did that. But you really need a good wiring diagram. So I actually created my own wiring diagram, which you can see here. These are printed A3. There's 3 pages to it, and I've had these laminated as well. These are created by me in a CAD package, and the layout is not that different to the version that you can get through the P5 Club. So I absolutely recommend, if you remember, getting a copy of those. But as I say, because I wanted to make changes, I created my own. And then I created a kind of a version purely for my car with the changes. So these are, if you do want these, say these are printed A3, which is really useful because there's a lot of detail there. But if you want a copy of these are available on the website as well. Completely up to you. There's laminated version and just plain paper version as well. But absolutely, you need a really good wiring diagram. Okay, so let's show some photos of the process I went through. Okay, so we've looked at some of the tools and some of the process I went through in rewiring my car. So this is some photos from the process. I don't have a lot of video from this, unfortunately, but I'll talk you through some photos. So this is the old loom, and you can see in several places where the wiring is fraying. Both at the bullet connectors, but also kind of part way along the wire. You can also see where wire is spliced together. I mean, fortunately they kept the same colour roughly here, but it's going from braided wire to PVC insulated wire. That makes fault finding quite difficult on car wiring, and you can just see how kind of tired all the wiring is. On its own, that could have been replaced or fixed rather, re-terminating, splicing in new parts of wire, but there were lots of other reasons I'll talk about now that made me want to change it. This is the wiper motor before I replaced the harness. Again, you can see bullet's not inserted properly, and that's part of the reason why I recommend that bullet insertion tool. But you can also see, I mean, you can't, it's really difficult actually to tell what colour these old wires were, starting to fray and look a bit, well, certainly looking very tired. Again, I could have left it, but it's just the whole thing was starting to look worse and worse the more I got into it. This is the back of the ignition switch. Again, you can see frayed wiring, frayed braided wiring. This wire in particular was looking really horrible. I think that's meant to be purple, but it's quite difficult. The braiding, unfortunately, it does pick up dirt quite easily, and it can be quite difficult on old cables to tell what colour it should actually be. Again, nothing there was terrible. I could have re-terminated things, but you can just see how tired the wiring is. This was a view under the dashboard. So this is going along. This is the main loom going along the back of the dashboard. This is the harness going up to the instruments. The steering column is here. And you can see again, bullets not inserted properly. Again, not a major problem, but certainly needs sorting out. But these connection blocks here, so these bullet connectors, they're not the most reliable of connectors. They're kind of sprung steel, and they can break, but also they're not a particularly positive kind of holding the bullet connector in. And what you can see here is, because there had been an engine fire in the car about 5 years ago before I owned the car, they had actually replaced the wiring in the engine bay by just splicing on loom from a different car to the loom under the dashboard. So there are actually about 60 of these bullet connectors under the dashboard, and it was just kind of a real weak point in the car's wiring. I mean, you can see how dirty everything is, but it's a 50-year-old car. But this thing here, actually just worth mentioning, this is a kind of connection point for the large 1/2-inch crimp terminals, and the ammeter shunt is actually in here as well. So there are actually, I think, 8 wires connecting here. So this is where the large 1/2-inch connectors are used. This is a last view. You can see here the wire is actually frayed down to the insulation. You can see the copper insulation there, and on this wire here you can see it's actually double layer braiding, but the outer brayer is just crumbling on
that wire. So the whole thing really quite sad and quite in quite a bad way. Last view of the old wiring. So this is the fuse box. You can see how dirty everything was. You can also see how there's a lot of surface rust on the metalwork, so I wanted to sort that out as well. You can also see on this car it should be braided here, but they've spliced in parts of a loom with PVC insulation. Again, not in itself a major issue. Certainly not original, but electrically safe if it's done well. But it had been spliced with those Bullock connectors, so I wanted to clean all of this, sort it all out properly. So I managed to find a new old stock loom on eBay. That could have been a bad move, because although it's new old stock, if it hadn't been stored very well, it still may be deteriorating. But actually, it was almost as new. The wiring is in really good condition on it. So I actually, because it was the height of summer, I kind of laid it out on the garden fence as it sits in the car. And that allowed me to make some changes to the harness. You can see I'm using the reusable Velcro cable ties, lots of places. So as you unwrap the harness tape, you can hold the loom together. It just makes working on the loom that much easier. You can also see these white PVC kind of flags I've added. So on every cable, I labelled each cable with what it was connecting to. And also under that in brackets, I put what the other end of that wire connects to. So you can see here, this wire is connecting to the ignition relay, and in some places I put the terminal number as well. And the other end of this is going to the ammeter shunt, or that connection block that we just saw, the ammeter shunt is part of. You can see on this wire, this is connecting to the ignition relay, and the other end of that is going to the starter solenoid. So it not only did that, I learned a lot about the wiring as I went through, with the continuity tester on the multimeter and labelling everything. But also doing that now, if I wasn't sure of something, I could check the wiring diagram that it matched the harness. But if something wasn't clear, I could go to the car and check. And while your car's still in one piece, you can use that as a reference as well. So you can really kind of answer all the questions you've got about the wiring harness before you go to fit it. This was removing the old wiring harness. So you can see, I tried to keep the old harness in one piece as much as possible. There are quite a few, especially bulb holders actually, that are very difficult to get. You can't get them new. So it's worth keeping the harness in as good a condition as possible, the old one, because there may be bits that you need to reuse. But this was just going through and removing, disconnecting everything and then removing the old harness. This is the new harness going in. You can see I've taken most of the dashboard padding apart, and I've replaced all of that. This is the loop. This goes along the end of the back of the dashboard. This part here actually goes down into the footwell, and this loom here is the rear loom. So there's a separate rear loom. It's quite small, but quite simple. But there's a separate loom that the front loom connects to, and it connects in the front passenger footwell. I was just starting to go through, lay the loom out, starting to bend it, because it's actually quite inflexible when it's wrapped with loom tape. So starting to form it so that it would fit, sit in the car properly. Another view of that, you can see, the dashboard. I used the opportunity to refurbish most of the woodwork in the dashboard as well, while I've got things apart. So this is the front passenger footwell, and as I say, the main loom goes through here and out, and then it connects to the rear loom here. So there's a lot of connectors here that sit in the panel behind the trim piece. And what I did to protect the loom as I pushed it through panels, I got some polythene. it's on a roll, and I think it's the stuff that's used to make plastic bags, so you can cut it and heat seal it, or heat seal it and cut it. So companies use it to create small plastic bags, and it's about 6 inches wide, quite thick polythene. But I just basically used that to protect the loom. So it protects the connectors and the harness tape as well, as you push it through. And then once the harness is in place, you can just pull it off, and the loom is there undamaged in situ. So I used it here. I also used it where the harness goes through into the engine bay. At the same time, I refurbished the Instrument Binnacle. So this is a kind of bakelite phenolic resin type plastic. It's quite brittle. You can spray it. The factory actually sprayed the front piece, and the back piece is covered in vinyl, and it was all peeling off on my car. So I replaced the vinyl, which looks quite smart. This is the fuse box area with the new harness going in. So you can see the fuse box has all been cleaned, all the metal work has been refinished, powder coated and sprayed. You can just see here, this is the harness going under the bonnet hinge, and then it goes up here and into the dashboard. I don't think you would be able to feed that through with the bonnet hinge in place, so I removed the bonnet hinge and again took the opportunity to respray the bonnet hinges. And you can see I've also refurbished the handbrake mechanism. So, you know, while you've got the harness out, it makes it much easier to refurbish large parts of the car as well. It's just another view of that. The new harness going in. This is my other car, Alfa Romeo, my other classic car. You can see I took the lights out. Yeah, you can see that better here. So I took the lights out while I got the harness out, and there was no rot, but there was surface rust behind the lights. So I removed all that with phosphoric acid and then reprimed it and actually resprayed the front of the car. Took that opportunity. So yeah, you can get lots of the screws and things like that from Wadhams for the lights, and refurbish the lights. You know, things like the adjuster screws, quite important. This is starting to come together, so I've got the binnacle in position now and starting to feed the wiring through. This is just a close-up of that. This gets very crowded on a P5B. There's a lot of wiring in here, so it's quite tight to get all the wires in. This is the front of the binnacle. Kind of, I hung it on wires from the roof and protected the front of it. You can see this is the speedometer with the warning lights. This is the tachometer. This is the kind of inductive loop that triggers the tachometer. This is going to the coil. And these are the switches. So there's a lot of wiring going on in here. It's quite tight. Certainly when you go to refit it, you have to kind of persuade the wiring into position. But yeah, it's, you know, logically just going through everything and reconnecting everything and checking it off against the wiring diagram. That's just one of the refurbished switches. You can see here there's a cable up there with the flag on. This was the front of the car after I'd resprayed it, so before I put the lights in, so starting to come back together. Again, I think the wiring to the binnacle was pretty much finished there. You can see how busy that is. If I just zoom in a bit there. Yeah, there's a lot of wiring, and when you try and push this back, you have to persuade the wiring back into position. Yeah, that was starting to come together. I've now got the lights back in and starting to test everything. Yeah, that's another view of the lights going back in. So this is testing the headlights and side lights, and you can see the bonnet lights are on as well. So I went through when I put the new harness in, took all the fuses out, and then when I first connected the battery, I made up a short length of wire between the positive cable that goes into the car and the battery, and put a 5 amp inline fuse. I mean, you could try a 2 amp probably. For some of the low, certainly initially, maybe use 2 amp before you switch anything on. And that's just really because that wiring between the battery and the fuse box is unprotected. So if you've got a short or something, that is going to short out. So put an inline fuse connector in that cable and connect it to the battery, and that protects that. So I took all the fuses out, connected that up. There was no smoke, which was a good sign. Then I started putting the fuses in one by one. So started with the first fuse, fuse 1 to 2, and checked everything worked there, checked that the voltages were what I expected around the ignition switch and things like that. And then removed that fuse, then put the next fuse in, checked that, and basically went through it that way. So checking each circuit individually, and then once I'd been through all of that, I started putting the fuses in and leaving them in, and just kind of building up my confidence, but also the certainty of the wiring being correct. So you can see here I'm testing the side lights and headlights, and yeah, it worked really well. Another view of the fog lights on and side lights, and the bonnet lights are on. As I say, it worked very well. And this was actually once the car had moved under its own steam, so everything was working, all the fuses were in, everything was working as expected. You can see all the lights and grille are back in, and the car had started and moved. And that's just a last view of the engine bay. So you can see I refurbished everything really around the engine while I got the wiring out. So things like the heater fan motor, the windscreen wiper motor, because as you saw earlier, a lot of the cabling going into these things was really in poor condition as well. So that's separate to the harness. The harness plugs into the wires that come out of the windscreen wiper motor. So I actually replaced the wiring into the motors here. And refurbished the housing as well. See the coil and the ballast resistor over on this side, and the power steering reservoir, refinished all that. Even things like the vacuum hoses for the brakes and the servo. That was it. That was it basically done. That was it. So if this video's been of interest, then please give me a thumbs up, a like. Please subscribe as well. I'm going to try and make as many videos as I can about the car, about the Rover. Most of them will be in the garage, but there may be some like this when it's too cold or too wet, or I don't feel like being in the garage. Please thumbs up, subscribe, leave a comment if you've got any thoughts or suggestions or better ways of doing things. Please leave a comment. Please also look at roverp5.com. I'm writing up an article on this in some detail. There are links below to all of the tools I used and in the article as well. So yeah, thanks. Until next time.